So next we'll look at the interest rate, what makes the interest rate happen. And this is a theoretical formula because the computation of these are quite difficult, but theoretically I think it's quite clear. The rate that's required by an investor, we'll call that a required rate of return for debt, okay, equals the risk-free rate. And what that means is it's the rate if there were no inflation, also no risk. We use the T-bills for this particular rate, US Treasury bills is a risk-free rate, and real means like we're going to exclude the inflation. Then we need an inflation premium. The reason we have to add inflation premium is easily explained. Let's say that this year there's no inflation and the interest rate you're offered is 2%. So okay, there's no inflation. I get 2% real return on my investment. Okay, set that aside. Next, let's say you're sitting here this year and we expect a spike in inflation of say 10%. Now how does that look? If you put in money now and you get 2%, a year from now, that 2% doesn't make up for the cost of living going up by 10%. So you're going backwards. One way to think about it is, okay, give me a real return, say 2%, and then let's add to it the inflation we expect, in this case 10%. So far we would want 12%, right? Risk-free rate of 2 plus the inflation rate of 10. Next one is default risk premium. And what this means is the premium's a little bump. What's the little bump I would expect or require more than expect for me taking on that risk? So let's say it's General Electric. So General Electric has a pretty good debt rating, but is not exactly the same as the US government. The risk-free rate might be 2%, the inflation might be 10, and the little premium for GE might be pretty small. Like it could be 0.2. So it's 2 plus 10 plus 0.2 or 12.2. Now, just as an aside, what if it was a very risky proposition? Let's say GoPro, right, which is having some financial trouble. So now you say, whoa, GoPro is more risky than GE and it's much more risky than US government. So I would need maybe 2 extra points, 2 extra percentage points. So now for GoPro, it would be the risk-free rate of 2, inflation rate of 10, plus a risk premium of 2. So 2 plus 10 plus 2, 14%. So that starts to show how investors would differentiate between the different investments based on the risk. The last one is liquidity premium, and this is how much do I pay to defer my use of money? This is based on a number of factors, alternative investments and the length of time. But for you to be denied the use of money, you should have a premium because you have to wait a year or 2 or 5 to get your money. And then the last is maturity risk premium. What is the risk of me not receiving the full amount at the maturity? So you add all those numbers together, and again, some are more objectively identified than others, but you add them all together and you get a desired rate of return for debt. What is the nominal risk-free rate? And by that we mean, when we look at the US Treasury, that is risk-free rate. However, there is still a small inflation risk. What we have is a formula that is as follows. 1 plus the real rate of return. This term right here is 1 plus the real risk-free rate of return. And then to that, we add 1 plus the inflation period. Then we subtract the 1. And the reason we do this is that we require return on the inflation as well. So this is the proper formula. And often we take a shortcut. And the shortcut, as I just did in the previous example, is I took the risk-free rate, which is the R star here with the asterisk, and then I just simply added inflation. But the proper calculation is where we go 1 plus R times 1 plus the inflation premium minus 1. And so that would be the proper calculation to get at the nominal return. How do we measure the inflation premium? One way to do it is take a surrogate and see what it tells us. And the surrogate is that there is a security called a TIPS. It's a Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, and it's indexed to inflation. So when we look at what is the current yield on the TIPS, we have a view of what the marketplace thinks the inflation rate is going to be. So it's a kind of a quick way to look at the inflation rate for given periods. If you're looking at a 1-year term, you're looking at tips and what interest rate is embedded for 1 year. If it's 2 year, you move out. You move out to what's a tips with a maturity 2 years from now and look at what inflation rate is built into that particular security as compared to a risk-free treasury. And that's why we use tips, because they're all risk-free, right? We have no other blurring factors of default and other types of risk. The inflation premium can be estimated by looking at treasury securities. Another important phrase that we use in fixed incomes or bonds is spreads, right? And it's the difference between rates. And here we're going to look at the default risk premium and the liquidity premium. And that shows what you give up if you're investing in a corporate bond compared to a treasury. In this particular case, we look at liquidity premiums and default risk, and we see this relationship. So that the entire spread between the corporates and the treasury is equal to the default risk, which is 0 with the treasury, and the liquidity premium from the security itself. What we observe over time is that large, strong companies often have very, very small liquidity premiums because they're highly liquid, and we capture most of the variation in the treasury, the inflation, and the default risk. And so when you look at larger companies, however, then the liquidity premium may be as high as 2% because they might not be as actively traded and not as easily sold on the market.